Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the GHG Coordination Working Group. This is working group number 6. I'm sorry, I think that was my dog in the background. Before we get started, just a reminder that the presentation materials that we're sharing today are going to be available on the GHG Coordination Working Group webpage. You can get there by navigating to kaiso.com. And from that main homepage, go to the Stay Informed tab. Under the Stay Informed tab, you'll see Policy Initiatives, and that will take you to our main initiative landing page. And you could search for the GHG Coordination Working Group page there. And the documents from today will be some of the top ones on that list. My name is Elena Kopolov-Alford, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs, while Isabella is out today. And I'm joined on the line by some members of our ISO team, including Keone Almeida, who will be the facilitator for today, and Kevin Head, who will be taking us through the presentation. Okay, and just some housekeeping reminders, this call is being recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. Any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. These collaborative working groups are intended to stimulate open dialogue and engage different perspectives. We welcome your feedback and questions, and please keep comments professional and respectful. To raise your hand, if you connected to your audio through the computer, you can select the raise hand icon, or if you dialed in, you can select #2 to raise your hand and get into the question queue. And you can send your question to all panelists or to me, Elena Kopolov-Alford, and you can, if you need technical assistance, you can contact Info Events listed here as the host. And just a reminder for today, please be reminded that commissioners and advisors from state public utility commissions may be in attendance. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Keone.
Hi, hello everybody, and thanks for joining today's call. And just wanted to keep in mind that today's call is really stakeholder driven, so we're really wanting to hear from you. Also, on that last note about the notice to participants about the commissioners and advisors, keep in mind that the discussion on the reporting requirements also touches on different reporting structures and state requirements. So this topic has crossover with state coordination topics. And I'd like to also indicate that we apologize for the overlap with the other RA meeting that's associated with the CPUC today. We do our best to avoid that, but sometimes that does happen. And we're thinking that there shouldn't be a lot of conflict in that area anyway. So moving on to the agenda, I'll be going over, or actually Kevin Head will be talking about the GHG attribution in the EDAM and WEIM. And then I will be going over the stakeholder requested GHG metrics, and Kevin Head will also be providing input on that. And then I'll be going over the consolidated problem statements and prioritization. And then lastly, we'll go over next steps. So move on to the next slide. So this is where we're at now. Again, we thank you guys for participating in all these working groups and participating in the commenting and the surveys that we've had. So we're going to be moving on to the assessment part of it. So move on to, we'll get started here with the GHG attributions in EDAM and WEIM. Kevin, do you want to take it from here?
Keone? Yeah, sure. Can you confirm you can hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. All right. Hey, everyone. Kevin Head from the ISO's Market Analysis Group. And I will be talking a bit about some GHG-related background and sort of overview of how the attribution mechanism works. So, you know, in previous groups, we've heard some feedback that folks wanted to hear more about the attribution mechanism, how it works, why we have it set up the way that it is set up today. It won't cover too much about how EDAM is going to work in the future, but a lot of these core concepts will carry forward into EDAM. So the purpose of that is to really form that basis of understanding that's in a way that's common across the entire stakeholder community, and hopefully dismiss some misconceptions that we've heard along the way, and just make sure that we're all working from a common shared set of facts, so that when we develop our problem statements and continue to refine them, we're all working from that common basis. I really hope that the discussion can be interactive, so feel free to raise your hand at any time, and I'll ask Yelena or Keone to flag that if there are hands raised and I miss them. So if we could just go to the next slide, please. Great. So the hope after today's discussion is that folks will be able to explain how we've implemented the current WEIM GHG attribution mechanism and sort of why we implemented it the way that we did. Also define some key terms such as the GHG marginal cost, secondary dispatch, those types of things. And then maybe provide some reasons why a resource may be dispatched below their base schedule. I can talk a little bit about what I mean by that in a little bit. And as I mentioned, the end goal of that is really to carry forward into the rest of the working group later today, where we talk about GHG related metrics and the development of problem statements to make that conversation more productive and hopefully interactive as well. Next slide, please. So core concept here is, why does the ISO have a GHG attribution mechanism? Well, you know, it all stems from the need to, it stems from CARB's cap and trade program and mandatory reporting regulations, specifically how those programs regulate the imports of electricity into the state of California. They state that, you know, imports of electricity into California, such as WEIM import transfers, have certain reporting requirements, such as that the specific generator that generated that electricity is appropriately identified and then reported to the ARB as part of their regulations. I'm not going to go too far into how their regulations work. That's kind of their purview. But insofar as they intersect with our market, the primary way is through the attribution of these WEIM import transfers. The way that that works is that the GHG attribution mechanism, which I should explain as kind of an aspect of the WEIM market, which, you know, the WEIM market handles the imbalance energy transactions between balancing authority areas across the West. And those transactions oftentimes result in a net import of energy into the state of California. And so the GHG attribution mechanism identifies what the megawatt quantity of that import is, and then it assigns that import to specific generating resources. The next slide kind of has a visual explanation of how this looks. So if you wouldn't mind, thanks, perfect. Cool. So on the left, we have the area of California. We've got 4 balancing authority areas that are entirely within the state of California, the California ISO BAA, as well as some other California BAAs. And then we kind of have on the right side the rest of the West. And this is kind of an example market interval where we have a 100 megawatt net WEIM import into the state. And just for example purposes, that import comes from the Pacific Core West Balancing Authority area, Nevada, Arizona. And so that 100 megawatt import is then assigned to 3 specific resources. In this case, it's you know, a resource in Pacific Core gets 40 megawatts, Nevada gets 20 megawatts, and APS gets another 40 megawatts. That's the core concept. We have this WEIM import coming into the state of California, and then the GHG attribution mechanism is just allocating it out to those specific resources. And the way that that works is something that I'll cover a little bit later on in the slides. So if we could go to the next slide, please. All right, so, core concept isn't that difficult, right? We're assigning a import into the state to specific resources. So what's with all the complexity that we have in our market design? Well, there's three sort of core constraints that the ISO's attribution mechanism is subject to. And I'll go through each of those in summary here, and then the next few slides will explain what those constraints are and why they're set up in that particular way. So first, the GHG attribution mechanism. If you wouldn't mind, I could go back one slide, please, and just go through those three. Great, thank you. So the three main constraints here are that the GHG attribution mechanism has to integrate with the least cost dispatch principles on which our market functions, right? The ISO's markets function on these least cost and security constrained dispatch principles. And the GHG attribution mechanism isn't an exception to that rule. Second, the price impacts to load. So in other words, how much load is paying for the energy that they're consuming has to be limited to only within the state of California. And third, the participation in the attribution mechanism must be voluntary. In other words, the ISO's market can't attribute energy coming into the state of California to a resource that hasn't made themselves, elected to be attributed into the state. All right, now we can go to the next slide, please. All right, so some core concepts here. How do we integrate the design with least cost dispatch principles? Well, first, similar to a lot of other types of offers into our market, GHG bids are subject to a resource-specific cost-based cap. And that's the formula for that is shown on the screen here. It's pretty simple. It's just a function of the resource's emissions rate, the efficiency of the resource, and then an allowance index price that the ISO gets from a couple of third-party vendors. And so because it's tethered to the resource's physical characteristics and that allowance index price, it's meant to sort of approximate the costs of compliance with the program. We implemented that cost-based cap in response to a FERC order, I guess about 10 years ago, whereas previously it was just limited to $1,000 per megawatt hour. So that's the first way that we are aligned with least cost dispatch is we have a cost-based cap on the offer prices coming into the GHG market. The next slide shows another way that we do it, and it'll take a little bit more background explanation. So the graph on the screen right now is just a pretty simple supply curve. On the y-axis, we have the GHG price, and the x-axis, we have the eligible GHG capacity. I'll talk a little bit about what that eligible GHG capacity is on a later slide, but you can just think of it as a quantity in terms of megawatts. And this is for just a random 5-minute interval back in August of 2023. And you can see here by the different fuel type what the GHG bids are. So down at the far left of the bid stack are water and wind resources, which have a $0 bid. Actually, I added $1 just so it would show up on the graph, but they have functionally a $0 bid because they don't have any emissions associated with their output. Moving up to the right, in other words, upwards on the supply curve, we have gas resources, which have different varying levels of emissions based on their efficiency. We move into coal, and then to the far right, we have some other gas resources, which might just have some relatively low efficiencies. So pretty simple supply curve. And just to be clear, this is the GHG bid adder price. This doesn't show the energy bid price that the resources also offered in order to participate in the WEIM. At the bottom, there's a green bar. The green bar indicates whether the resources represented above have received a GHG award. In other words, whether those resources have been attributed to serve demand in the state of California. You can see here that the total, the sum of all those GHG awards is equal to the total megawatts of imported energy into California. And for the purposes of this chart, that's essentially our demand. The total the total megawatts of import into California is effectively like a vertical demand curve. And you can see that where that demand curve intersects the supply curve, that's what's setting the GHG marginal price of, I don't know, $25. So this is just to illustrate some pretty simple price formation theory here, where where supply meets demand, that's what sets the marginal price. It doesn't always work this way, but I think for the purposes of our conversation today, it's a pretty good way of thinking about how the GHG bid price is set. So I can maybe pause here and see if folks have any questions about this first section of the slides. Elena, are you seeing anybody?
No, I'm not seeing any hands raised. Nothing in the chat.
Cool. All right, so I can move on to that next slide, please. All right, so the next piece is the next constraint that the ISO's market is subject to is that the price impacts to load have to be limited only to the load that's located in California. And so here we have kind of a relatively old chart that I think illustrates this point really well. And so for this particular example, we have two generators. Both are GHG emitting generators. One's located in Pacific Core, and one's located inside of the California ISO's BAA. Both of them have a fuel cost of $30 and a GHG cost of $5. The California resource includes both the fuel cost and the GHG cost together in one energy offer price. And for the purposes of this example, that's the resource that sets the LMP of $35, the 30 plus the 5. The Pacific Core generator has an energy offer of $30, just representing their fuel costs, and then a $5 separate GHG bid adder that they've submitted. And that's the $5 is what the price would show up as in that supply curve in my previous slide. In this case, that $5 GHG price is the marginal GHG price. It sets the $5 GHG price, and that will get paid $35. If it's, in this case, it's been deemed to serve California load. In other words, it's received a GHG award. And so it'll get paid the $30 that represents its fuel costs and an additional side payment of $5, which is the GHG marginal cost. The load inside the state of California is going to pay $35. And so they're functionally paying that additional $5 to the Pacific Core generator located outside of the state. The load outside of the state only pays $30, which is calculated as the difference between the $35 and the $5 GHG cost. So as I mentioned, the LMP inside of the state of California, setting aside losses and congestion, is going to be $35, and the LMP outside of the state is going to be $30. So in that way, that we limit the price paid for GHG just to load inside of the state of California. And then we'll move on to the third slide, which is relatively cursory, and it's just how do we ensure that participation in this market is voluntary? Well, the WEIM doesn't require GHG bids to be submitted by any resource. It's entirely voluntary. It's available to those market participants that wish for their output to be deemed to serve load in California. That was created back in the mid-2010s as part of some market enhancements that we've done. So just a quick recap. The next slide has just the answers to those questions that I posed in the beginning, which is, how does the GHG attribution mechanism integrate with least cost dispatch principles? Well, first, it ensures that bid prices are subject to a cost-based cap. And two, it ensures that the GHG bids are awarded based on the GHG bid price in sort of a standard microeconomics least cost marginal pricing approach. Second, how are price impacts limited to only load in California? Well, the GHG marginal cost is only paid by load in the state of California, and that payment goes to the generators that were deemed to deliver that energy into the state. And then third, how is it voluntary? Well, the GHG bid itself is an entirely voluntary market to participate in if you're a WEIM participating resource. So that's sort of an overall background. I hope I kind of illustrated the most common way that GHG prices are set, and also maybe some explanation of why we developed the market in the way that we did. Are we getting any questions or hands up?
From Ross.
I couldn't entirely pick that out, but would you mind?
I was saying you have a hand up from Rasa. If the event producer could open his line.
Can you hear me now?
So you are now unmuted.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Great. My question for you, Kevin, is you had something on your slide that said that the ISO collects the extra 5 megawatt hour, $5 per megawatt hour for transfer to ISO from the ISO load. So that means that an EIM entity that's outside of the ISO does not have to pay anything. Like they don't, if they don't bid into GHG, then they don't have to pay for it, right?
Yeah. So if Elena, if you wouldn't mind going back to 15, slide 15. Yeah, a resource that's outside of the state of California, if that's deemed delivered to serve load in California, they get a $5 in this example side payment effectively from load inside of the state to that particular generating resource. But if you're a balancing authority area that's outside of the state of California, then your price isn't including the GHG price. It doesn't include that $5. So in this case, the Pacificor load has a price of $30, and that is not including the GHG cost. Does that answer your question, Rasa?
I had an echo, so I'm going to put it in the chat.
Okay. Cool. Maybe we can see if we have any other questions, hands up in the meantime.
If you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand.
I have a question from John Dieppe.
Hey, John, go ahead, and if you wouldn't mind
On from Southern
clarifying
California,
there.
Edison. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm a little bit new to this initiative, so please bear with me. So my understanding is that Washington has a new cap and trade program as well, right? Can you provide a little bit of background on how folks from the WIM can differentiate their bids between California and Washington?
Sure. Yeah, good question. So Washington State implemented a cap and invest program, which is similar to the cap and trade program that California has. That program went live last year. The WEIM doesn't have a mechanism to attribute energy to serve load in Washington yet, the way that it's been designed to serve load in California. So in this case, let's say there's a Pacific-Core generator and they want to indicate that they wish for their energy to go to Washington. There's no mechanism in the WEIM that enables that transaction. However, in the extended day-ahead market initiative, which is expected to go live in early 2026, we're creating that functionality. So it isn't yet a market function that we have, but we're developing the market software and the rules that will go behind it. But it'll be very similar to how we've implemented, in fact, it'll be the same as how we've implemented the rules for California, in that they can indicate with a separate GHG bid whether they want their load to serve Washington. It'll have additional functionality. For example, you can, if you're an external to both California and Washington, you can submit 2 GHG bids, one with a price to serve California and one with a price to serve Washington. And that resource can be attributed to serve one of those 2 areas. It might be determined to serve both of those areas, and it might be determined to serve none of those areas, just depending on the relative economics of what's happening in the market.
Great, thank you. Thanks, appreciate it.
Yep.
Okay, we've got a few more questions in queue. Let's go to Mark Smith next.
Hey, Kevin, it's Mark Smith with Calpine. Can you remind me the GHG side payment that goes to external generators, is that collected from load through a separate charge code? How is that funded?
Being a little out of my area of expertise, in that it's kind of a post-market application. But yeah, I believe that there is like a separate charge code that tracks that.
Okay. And it's something that's charged to all load and exports or something or other, or metered demand? Okay. I'll look into that one.
Okay, yeah, sorry, it's sort of outside of my main wheelhouse, but the gist of it is that it's effectively included, it's baked into the price that load pays, but I'm not sure exactly how it flows through all of the different settlement charge codes.
But it's post-process, so it doesn't come into the LMP formulation at all within California.
Oh, no, it doesn't. It is baked into the LMP, or more specifically, it's a negative component of the LMP for load outside of the state.
Right.
So if you're in Arizona or something, your LMP is going to be lower if the GHG cost is non-zero, just as it's shown on the slide. That yeah. Okay.
Thanks, Kevin. I'll dig into it. Thank you.
Cool. Yep. Thank you.
Okay, let's go to Angela.
On the screen right now in the previous slide, and why you're calling that a GHG marginal cost. I would think marginal cost would be changing depending on how many megawatts you are into the bid stack. And then I know this is just illustrative too. And then why is it $5 here and the last chart was a different number, or I'm looking at that. Maybe I'm getting these two things mixed up, but I'm just not sure why this is called a marginal cost, GHG cost. It looks like an average.
Yeah, sure.
That's all.
Oh, gotcha. Okay. Yeah. So, point taken, I guess. The idea. This is a very simplified example where there's only one resource that is serving load inside of California, outside of the state. But if Yelena, if you wouldn't mind going back to slide 14, I think it is. Yeah, perfect. So this is the bid cost, or the supply curve for these GHG bid adders. And the GHG marginal cost is where the demand meets the supply. And so we call it a GHG marginal price or marginal cost. It's not reflective of the kind of average of the bids below, like the inframarginal bids. It's set at the point where supply and demand meet. So that's why we call it marginal. Is that helpful? Maybe I'm not interpreting your question correctly. It looks like she's muted again. If we wouldn't mind, thanks.
Yeah. Yep. Thanks. I just think of a marginal cost or a marginal component as the next component in the bid stack. And this one just looks like it's a specific point, no matter where you're bidding in. It's static as opposed to dynamic for each bid. But maybe I'm just thinking about it incorrectly. So that's what I always think of marginal is the next increment, not exactly where they would meet.
Gotcha. So the total, the green bar at the bottom can change its width, right? So
Right.
there could be intervals where California is importing less or more. And so then that would shift where the demand curve is hitting the supply curve. And so say it's down where hydro is, the WATR, the water bids, and it's at, say, 500 megawatts of a transfer into California. The 501st megawatt would still be zero. So that would be the GHG marginal cost in that case.
Okay. All right. Okay, that helps a lot. Thank you. I get it now. Sorry about if my question was a little vague. Thank you.
No, great question. Thank you.
Okay. Can we go to the next page? Okay, go ahead.
Hi, this is Anu from LADWP. Kevin, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, yep.
Okay, actually, we're on the right slide. So I just wanted to make sure I understand this correctly. So it seems like there's close to 1,700 megawatts coming into California as part of this WEIM transfer. And the GHG marginal price for all those is $25. So there's a collection of 1,700 times 25, which is $42,500 collected from load in California. And it seems to me 1,000 megawatts of those are water and wind. So the actual compliance costs associated with the transfer is really 700 times 25. And so it seems like there's an overcollection of $25,000 in this instance. Is my understanding correct in that?
So I don't think that's entirely correct. So the total value that's going to be collected is the GHG marginal price times all load in California, right? It'll be all, I think it is meter demand to what Mark Smith was asking about earlier. So it's, you know, say there's 10,000 megawatt hour, or I don't know if that's realistic, 20,000 megawatts of demand in a particular 5-minute interval. It's going to be that 20,000 times 25, right? And it's because it's not just the transfer that's receiving the cost; it's the total meter demand in the state, and then the meter demand outside of the state is not going to have that same cost.
Okay.
And then in terms of over collection, I don't know if I would characterize it like that, because, you know, marginal pricing markets purposefully bake in a producer surplus into them in order to ensure that there's incentive for everybody to submit offers into the market. And, you know, just using kind of microeconomics, like a marginal pricing market that's efficient is going to maximize benefits in total, which is both the sum of the benefits that go to the generators and the benefits that go to demand. So I don't know if I'd characterize it as an overcollection, but I hear your point that those generating resources that are non-emitting won't need to go out and procure compliance obligations because they're non-emitting.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. But trying to link that to the CARB policy, do you know if that was the intended purpose of CARB's policy, or this is something that was implemented to try and implement what was thought to be the CARB's policy and has ended in what I refer to as overcollection, and what seems like you're referring to a baked-in revenue for all resources to make their resources available for demand? My understanding, my understanding was this was supposed to be sort of a carbon tax, but I wonder if your understanding is different than that.
Gotcha. So I definitely don't want to opine on CARB's intent. I think those questions are better directed at them. But taking a step back and going to like an earlier slide, the ISO's market design is really intended to characterize how much energy is coming into the state of California, and then to what resources that energy can be assigned to. And the way that we've implemented that is through this bid-based approach. So yeah, that's where I would say, I mean, this is the mechanism by which we've determined that we're currently enabling that energy to come into the state and still be able to be assigned to specific resources.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Okay, let's go to Stuart Kelly.
Now that Washington has the equivalent of cap and trade, or its pricing mechanism for GHG, if a resource is in California, just remind me, are those resources going to have the ability in the future design to break out the GHG component, or is it going to be assumed within the bid that both the energy and GHG component are combined as it is today in California? Because I'm thinking the GHG pricing is going to be different in Washington compared to California. And if I have a single resource, you know, the energy cost or the energy bid wouldn't necessarily, just for the purpose of simplicity, wouldn't necessarily change in my example, but I may want to distinguish the GHG component. Kevin, do you, I don't think the future design contemplates the ability to break out the GHG component and say, I want to bid into California, or I'm in California, my GHG is part of my bid, but I want to bid into Washington, but I want to bid in with a different GHG price as part of my bid. That's not contemplated in the future design, is that correct? It'll just be it'll just be a single bid for both, the same bid effectively for both California and Washington, is that correct?
The design as it is contemplated today, which is assuming that the two programs aren't linked and there's no kind of reciprocity between the two, will have, if it's a resource in California, they'll include their, let's just keep it simple, fuel costs in their energy bid, as well as their expected compliance costs for California's program. So that'll be their California energy bid. But then they can also make their energy available to serve Washington with a separate WEIM, or I shouldn't use the term WEIM, a separate Washington GHG bid adder. So maybe, Yelena, if we could go to 15 again, the California ISO resource is going to have a $35 energy bid, but then say their expected compliance cost for Washington's program is $6, they can submit in EDAM in the future a $6 GHG bid adder that's separate from their energy bid.
Okay, so there's going to be the functionality, a resource in California, let's say it bids $35 for California in your example, $30 fuel cost, $5 GHG, but then it has the elective to bid into Washington, and it can say, right, my fuel cost is still 30, but I want to bid $7 GHG. That functionality will exist, and we will be able to report on those marginal costs of GHG and all those payments. Is that correct for Washington?
Yeah, I think I followed you, and just make sure I'm playing back what you said. So the fuel cost will be $35. Their California GHG costs will be $5. So that's a bid price of $35, and then a separate GHG bid to serve Washington of $7. And that's under the assumption that they're effectively, because if they're located in the state of California, we're assuming that they have a compliance obligation for that energy that's generated. And then when that energy is sent to Washington, they have an additional, in your example, $7 of compliance costs to comply with Washington's program. Does that answer your?
Okay, that's helpful. But that $37 into Washington, let's say it's $30 fuel, $7 GHG, are they input separately into cyber as separate components, or are they expected to be a single $37 bid as it is in California? Because resources out with GHG zones separate the energy component and the GHG component, as you know. I just want to understand if a resource is in a GHG zone and it's bidding to another GHG zone outside the GHG zone it's residing in, that the energy and the GHG bid are separate or combined. I'm just trying to clarify that.
Yeah, and I hear you, but I don't know if that resource would bid $37, because the assumption is that when they generate the energy in California, they get a compliance obligation in California, which they would, in the example, have a $5, the cost of compliance would be $5. And then they would have a separate GHG bid adder submitted separately in cyber from that 35 to have a $7 adder to serve Washington. So then their total bid would be $42, which is the $30 fuel cost, $5 of California compliance, and then $7 of Washington compliance.
Yeah, just keep it simple. So in California today, we don't separate out the GHG and the energy component. I'm trying to understand if I'm residing in California and I want to bid in Washington, I've got a different carbon cost in Washington. Can I separate out the energy and the carbon component in the future design, or will they be just treated as one single bid in Washington, as they are
It'll
in
be a
California?
separate, yeah, it'll be a
Yeah.
separate bid for the Washington GHG component.
So there'll be a separate energy and GHG component. What, or are you saying that you'll take the energy, the bid in California, and you can then supplement that GHG component? I'm just, is the energy component and the GHG component going to be bid in separately into Washington in the future if I'm residing in California?
They'll be separate, but I just want to make sure I understand what you mean by energy, because an energy bid in the state of California is going to be assumed to include fuel costs and GHG costs for the purposes of compliance with CARB.
Let me clarify.
Yeah.
Fuel cost.
Yeah.
Sorry. In your
Okay,
example, $30. So let's take your example. In California, I'm bidding in $35, single energy bid. Within that bid is $30 for energy, $30 for fuel, and $5 for GHG. It's a $35 bid. I want to make sure that in the future in Washington, as it is for the Pacific or generator, there is the ability to put in a fuel cost bid of $30 and a separate GHG price of $7.
Gotcha.
And I don't
Yeah.
have
So
to
there,
put in a single energy bid of 37 in your example. I'm putting in two components.
yeah, the fuel cost won't be able to be bid in separate from the California GHG costs for resources in California. Those two prices will still be combined just as they are today into one energy bid. The Washington GHG bid will just be a standalone thing to send for that resource to additionally send its energy to Washington.
Okay, so I indicate I want to sell Washington. My question is, will the fuel cost and the GHG cost be separate in that instance for a California resource? Or will it be a single energy bid as it is in California?
See, I think this is where we're conflicting here, because there's two different GHG costs, right? There's the GHG cost that arises because you're located in the state of California, and when you generate in the state of California, you get a compliance obligation. There's a separate GHG cost for once that energy is deemed to cross over into Washington. So the fuel cost and the California GHG cost together in one energy bid price. The Washington GHG will be in a separate standalone GHG bid adder just to serve Washington. Am I? Maybe we could take it offline.
Yeah, we can take it offline, but I mean, you're highlighting that the GHG component is separate. I'm just trying to make sure that you're also submitting a fuel cost component, because otherwise you're going to have to use the California bid as a reference point. But let's take it offline, because it's important to understand from a reporting perspective and a systems perspective. But thank you.
Okay. Sure, sounds good.
Okay, if we can go to Callie Well.
Hey, before Kelly gets started, this is Keone. I just want to remind folks that the participation list is in the link in the chat, so that people could see who's all on the call. WebEx did away with you guys being able to view who's all on the call, and we've had requests to show that. So this is a workaround to provide that to you. So I just wanted to let you know. Go ahead, Kelly.
Hey, Kelly. You're coming in a little quiet.
Okay, I'll try and talk louder. I've been having audio all day today, audio issues.
Gotcha.
I was just going to chime in to help that conversation a little bit because while I understand why you guys might want to take it offline, it's a really important point that I think Stuart was trying to make because it's something that we've been talking about and advocating for even through the EDAM policy, and that's the ability to have the design functionality allow all resources, including those within GHG areas, to separate out their fuel costs and all of the GHG cost components. Because I think the answer to Stuart's question is no. A resource in CAISO will still submit just the one bid, which is $35, and then we'll submit a separate $7 bid to go to Washington. And for the market, when it considers whether or not it will bring that energy into Washington, it will see $47 as the total cost. So it's almost, because the market doesn't allow the California resource to bid $30 separate from the $5 each for California. So I think it is a really important point because I think it also gets to some of the price formation concerns we've been having. And I think, Kevin, you'll be talking about what the marginal cost is and what it isn't in a couple slides, so I'll hold off until we get to that conversation. But I think there is a significant benefit in having that functionality, not just for the reporting purposes I think Stuart was getting at, but also for price formation. So hopefully that helps. Hopefully that helps Stuart as well. But I think the answer is no. I think based on what he was asking, the answer is going to be no. That functionality doesn't exist. And yes, Washington will see the $35 and the $7 when it brings that energy from California into us.
Yeah, I agree with your characterization and description of the issue, and maybe let's hold off on that conversation a little bit because the whole problem statement development process will help us maybe describe that problem, that those price formation issues that you're describing in a way that we can all kind of see and discuss and kick around. So
no, that's I was going to hold off my comments until you got through those slides, but I figured since there was a question asked already, I'd chime in and see if I could help at all. But all right, thanks.
Totally understand. Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it. All right. I'm not seeing any other hands. Maybe just for the sake of time, we can move on down into the second part of my my slides. Yeah, perfect. Actually, one more. All right, great. So as we hinted at, we wanted to offer, excuse me, some definitions of the following terms to help us down the road in developing the problem statements and refining the ones that we've already been kicking around. And so the hope is that we can kick around these three definitions and see if folks like how we've characterized them, or if we think that there's potential refinements. So that's the hope. But at least this is a good, hopefully, ground setting, level setting conversation that we can then build off of a bit later. So I'll move to the first item, and it's a term that we've been kicking around for the conversation, which is the GHG marginal cost. So if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, please. The GHG marginal cost in our business practice manuals and in our documentation has this sort of technical meaning, which is the shadow price of the net imbalance energy export allocation constraint, which in my view is helpful if you speak optimization speak, which is at best a third language for me. So I thought I'd offer kind of a more intuitive explanation, which is what's the change in the total cost paid by load if the WEIM transfer were to change by 1 megawatt hour? And this is really what I showed in that previous chart, and on the next slide, we'll show again. So remember that the WEIM transfer into California is allocated according to the relative GHG bid prices. So the next slide, please, Elena. Perfect. So that GHG marginal cost is set by the marginal GHG bid price. Those two terms are interchangeable. And that itself is based on the total megawatts of energy that's coming into the state of California through the WEIM. So, you know, if you move that bar, as I was saying earlier, if you make it a little bit wider, it could change the GHG marginal price. So if you move it to the right, it might move up to that next little plateau in the GHG bid curve and be moved from 25 to maybe $27. So, you know, a pretty intuitive explanation of what the GHG marginal cost is. There are some cases where this isn't always true, but I don't want to talk about those quite yet, but we might in the future. But that's sort of, to me, an intuitive explanation of what that marginal cost is. I also want to bring that up because there's a good, useful point of comparison, which is what isn't the GHG marginal cost. So if Elena, if you would mind going to the next slide, please. So the GHG marginal cost it's not a reflection of the costs associated with the marginal resource for energy. So what I mean by that is in the market optimization, there is a resource that sets something that we call the SMEC, which is the system marginal energy cost. It's not always one resource that sets it. Sometimes it's multiple. Sometimes it's not even a resource that sets it. It could be set at a penalty price, but just to keep it simple, let's assume that there's a resource that is the resource that sets the marginal energy cost. In other words, it's the resource that was the marginal generator. So if the, I'll just leave it at that. Let's assume that that resource is a GHG emitting resource. The GHG marginal cost in ISO parlance, the GHG marginal cost is not set at the GHG cost associated with that marginal resource. Instead, it's the GHG marginal cost associated with the transfer of energy into the state of California. There's two different concepts here, right? There's the marginal energy cost curve, which could have its own marginal cost curve similar to the one that I was showing in previous slides. That marginal resource might have GHG costs associated with it, but we don't capture that in our market. We don't report that anywhere, and it's separate from the GHG marginal cost, which is instead associated with the transfer of energy into the state of California. So those two things are different, and I just wanted to make that point clear, is that when we say the GHG marginal cost, it's not the marginal cost associated with the marginal resource in the market. So I think I kind of butchered that explanation, but maybe I can pause here to see if folks have any questions or if I could be a little bit more clear on that point.
We have a hand from Mark. And Mark, if you say your affiliation when you are unmuted, also that will help. Go ahead.
Hey, Kevin. So I completely agree. You know, your calculation is not representative of the marginal resource. I disagree a little bit with your characterization that it's the marginal cost of transfers, because the way you stack up your resources is convenient, but it's unrelated to anything that's tagged or actually flows into California. The quantity is the same, but it's not the same allocation of resources, correct? Am I right there?
So I think you're saying that maybe you can explain a little bit more. So you're saying that the WEIM transfer doesn't represent a physical transfer into the California area,
Oh,
or are you saying that
no, the amount is the same. It's 100 megawatts of transfers or 100 megawatts of physical, but the composition of that 100 megawatts that's actually flowing, you're assuming is this very nice linear stack of resources, whereas the actual resources that are tagged into the state that add up to that amount of transfers could be very, very different.
I would agree with you that the mechanism doesn't try to match the physical realities of the system. But I would say that that transfer is real and that our attribution mechanism is just our accounting mechanism to assign that to specific resources. But I think I understand your point, and yeah, maybe I could open it up to see if anyone has.
That's helpful. Okay, thanks, Kevin. Yeah, I think you and I agree in that case. Thank you.
All right. Do we have any other questions, comments?
We have a hand from Kelly.
Hi, it's Callie Wells again with WPTF. Just a quick question for you, Kevin. So on the example where the California resource bids 35 and $30 is the fuel cost and 5 is the GHG cost. I know that the $5 happen to exactly match the $5 GHG adder from the external resource, but if the internal resource actually had $29 fuel cost and a $6 GHG cost, we would still see just the $5 GHG shadow price, right? Because the market can't have complete transparency into the $6 GHG cost of the internal resource.
Correct. Yep.
Okay, so I think that maybe, I appreciate you kind of going through what's the GHG marginal, what's not the GHG marginal cost. I think that having that in there might also be useful to talk through from when we get to kind of the policy conversations, because I see one option might be, maybe we identify the GHG cost of the marginal resource, or another thought, and this is kind of going back to the conversation with Stuart, is what price formation would we see, and would there be any difference in the price formation? Because I think there would be if we have all resources separate out all of their GHG. So I think what you might end up getting in that example is you might end up getting a $6 GHG from the internal resource. I don't know because I haven't done the optimization, but I think it might be useful to kind of talk through that at some point, whether that's here in the policy process, if we get to the point of through what potential changes we might want to make.
Okay, yeah. Well, we'll see if we can put together some examples and try to continue that conversation in a future venue. I don't know if it'll be a working group or something else, but yeah, point taken. Thanks, Kelly.
All right, great, thanks.
All right, I'm not seeing anybody else in the queue after Callie. Maybe I can just keep cruising just so we can stay a little bit on schedule, though I don't want that to dissuade folks from asking questions. But moving on to slide 22, I wanted to cover another kind of core concept, which is eligible GHG capacity. And the reason why I wanted to cover this first is it then moves into the conversation of secondary dispatch, which is something that's been discussed in this venue and then in the EDAM working groups before this. So I just wanted to make sure that this concept is really kind of hitting home. And the eligible GHG capacity is effectively how much the market will have available to it to deem to serve load in California. In other words, it's the amount of capacity that can get a GHG award. And that's not always equal to how much energy the resource has made available through its bid. And so I'll explain what I mean. So in this example, the resource has a GHG bid capacity of 100 megawatts. That's also equal to how much they've bid in for just regular old energy. 100 megawatts, their GHG bid, is effectively them saying, hey, I'm willing for 100 megawatts of my resources output to be deemed delivered to serve California. In this example, the resource through the WEIM optimization gets a 90 megawatt energy award. So that's how much the market expects the resource to actually physically generate. And so that's also a constraint on how much eligible GHG capacity will bid in. You can see the formula at the bottom, but I'm trying to explain it kind of intuitively. So we're not going to award one more than the resource has made electively available to serve load in California. And we're not going to award more than the resource is actually physically generating. But the third component of that formula is a little bit more complicated. So let me just break it down into some subcomponents. So first we have the upper economic limit, which is effectively how much the resource can produce based on its physical characteristics, as well as how much its energy bid is. So in this case, they've said, hey, I think I can generate 100 megawatts. But let's say that the resource has some constraints on how quickly it can ramp from its current state up to the next market interval. Let's say that it's currently sitting at 50 megawatts, and based on how quickly it can ramp, it can't get up to 100 megawatts by the time the market interval comes about. And so the upper economic limit is given a little bit of a haircut because it can only get up to 95 megawatts. Or let's say, in a different example, that it's a really hot day out and the resource has submitted an outage for 5 megawatts to say, hey, my resource can really only get up to 95 megawatts because of the ambient air temperatures. So that's what the upper economic limit represents. The other piece is the base schedule, which I think will be familiar to a lot of WEIM participants, but in the context of the GHG discussion, we think of the base schedule as what the scheduling coordinator thinks that the resource would need to produce to meet the BAA's own native load requirements. So in this example, the scheduling coordinator says, hey, my resource needs to produce 40 megawatts to meet my BAA's load in this particular hour. Anything above that point, up to the upper economic limit, in theory, is therefore available to serve load elsewhere in the WEIM, right? Because the EIM is an imbalanced market. It's kind of dealing in those extra megawatts that are floating around above what's needed to meet their own native BAA's load requirements. So in my example, the upper economic limit is how much it can kind of reasonably be expected to produce based on its physical characteristics, minus the 40 megawatts that is needed to serve its own load. That 55 megawatts is what's available, therefore, to serve load elsewhere, and in our case, to serve load in the state of California. So the minimum of those three will set the eligible GHG capacity. It could be that the scheduling coordinator sets their GHG bid at 20 megawatts. So that top green bar would shorten down to 20 megawatts. And the thing that would set, the factor that would set the eligible GHG capacity would be the GHG bid capacity. Or maybe the resource only gets an energy award for 25 megawatts. So we're not going to attribute more than 25 megawatts of energy from that resource to serve load in California. So that's how we set the eligible GHG capacity. And the reason why I talk about that is to set up the conversation on the next slide, please, of secondary dispatch. And this is a concept that's kind of, has been created in these conversations. It's not like, I don't think like an official economic term. It's not something that is in our tariff anywhere, but it's a useful useful term that we can use to kind of discuss the eligible GHG capacity market design. So here's a different example, and it's shown a little bit differently than the previous slide. But on the left chart, we have a resource that has a 250 megawatt upper economic limit, which is how much they can be expected to produce based on their physical characteristics. The resource has a 150 megawatt base schedule, meaning that they have 100 megawatts of eligible GHG capacity between what's needed to serve their own native load and how much they can actually physically produce. So in this case, if they get a 100 megawatt GHG award, we would say that there's no potential for secondary dispatch. In other words, all 100 megawatts is sort of incremental to what's reflected in the base schedule. A different example is on the right, where same setup, the resource has a 250 megawatt upper economic limit, 150 megawatts of base schedule, and they have a 100 megawatts of eligible GHG capacity. But in this case, the resource only gets an energy award of 180 megawatts. So one way of looking at this would be that 30 megawatts was sort of incrementally dispatched above what was needed to serve their own native load requirements, in other words, that base schedule. And then 70 megawatts is down below their base schedule volumes because they've still received that 100 megawatt GHG award. And so we would call that 70 megawatts potential secondary dispatch. And a potential concern with that amount is that we're sort of just shuffling around megawatts. We're saying this resource has 100 megawatts of its load going to California, but then 70 megawatts from somewhere else is coming in to backfill that resource's output to meet that resource's native BAA's load. So that would be an issue if indeed that backfilling were to occur, because then we're not really assigning the appropriate megawatts to serve load in California. So that would be a problem, but what I hope to explain in the next slide is that there are cases where this same setup can occur, but is not actually due to backfilling. Thanks, Helena. Perfect. So we find situations where WEIM resources are dispatched below their submitted base schedule, and we see that happening for a variety of reasons. And when I say dispatched below their submitted base schedule, I mean that the difference between their energy award and their GHG award, that megawatt component dips down into their base schedule. So that would be the kind of light blue bar in the previous slide. Well, that can occur for a variety of reasons. Resource can be dispatched below its base schedule, for example, because of economic displacement. Effectively, there could be a resource that's in a neighboring balancing authority area that is indeed less expensive in terms of its energy bid to serve that BAA's native load. So just as an example, let's say we have a resource in Nevada with a 70 megawatt energy bid and a resource in Arizona with a 50 megawatt, $50 per megawatt energy bid. Well, Nevada doesn't know that that $50 resource exists in Arizona before the EIM market takes place. So they set their base schedule assuming that their resource is going to be needed to meet their own native load requirement. But then when the WEIM market kicks off, we now can see all of the relative bid prices across the WEIM footprint, and the WEIM will find the least cost solution to meet all of the load in the area. So then it'll say, hey, Nevada, you don't need to pay $70 for your energy. You can pay $50 for your energy. So you can actually decrease your resources output from where you thought you needed it to be, and instead have this Arizona resource serve your load at a cheaper price. In that case, that's economic displacement, and that would be one reason why we see a resource be dispatched below their base schedule. A different reason could be sticking with that same example, the Nevada resource is expected to generate at $70, and say they think that they're going to need 100 megawatts of output from that resource. But when their load forecast comes along for that particular 5-minute interval, turns out it's a little bit cooler than they thought it would be. Or I can't think of a better example. Let's say it's a little bit cooler than they thought it would need to be. And so they can actually decrease that resource's output a little bit because they don't need as much energy. And so that could be another case why a resource's energy award dips down below where their base schedule is. And then the third case would be that backfilling that I described earlier. And so what I hope to explain here is basically, while reason 3 might be considered an issue, perhaps even called leakage, due to secondary dispatch, reasons 1 and 2 wouldn't be. And so when we see cases of a resource sort of dipping down into its base schedule, it's not always a reflection of a flaw in the design of the WEIM. And so the last slide that I have in my deck is the same bid curve that we've been describing, but at the very bottom, I characterize how much of the resource's output is potential secondary dispatch. And so let's take the far left little sliver all the way to the left. That resource, all of its output the resource was effectively, all of its output was deemed delivered to serve California, all of its eligible GHG capacity, and all of that output is sort of below the resource's base schedule. Whereas that chunk that's to the right, that's only around 20, or let's call it 15%, only 15% of that resource's output is potential secondary dispatch. So when we publish metrics of how much potential secondary dispatch there is, that's sort of a visual explanation of how that looks for a particular 5-minute market snapshot. So when we're talking about GHG metrics in a little bit, we might want to have this image in our mind of how the ISO might go about calculating potential secondary dispatch. So that's sort of the end of this component of the presentation, but I think maybe we can open up the conversation a little bit to talk about eligible GHG capacity and potential secondary dispatch. Does anyone have any thoughts, comments, questions, concerns?
Okay, it doesn't look like we have any other questions. If we want to move on to the next slide.
There's 2 questions in queue.
Oh, okay.
Nadia, you are unmuted.
Hello. Hi. This is Nadia with Pacific Core. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, coming in great.
Yeah. Can you go back to the last slide, please?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, sorry, the previous one before that. Thank you. Yeah, so my question was for the right hand, the potential for secondary dispatch. Can you walk me through why it was 70 megawatts of potential secondary dispatch? Is that just the amount of potential for economic displacement?
Yeah, so the idea, so the formula is down at the bottom if you want to see it kind of formulaically, but the idea is that 150 megawatts was what the scheduling coordinator thought would be needed to meet their own native load. So that's one thing to keep in mind. But then we say through the WEIM optimization, 100 megawatts was deemed delivered to serve load in California. And then the third thing to keep in mind is their actual energy output, maybe we can just think of it that way, is 180 megawatts. So then one way of looking at this would be that only 80 megawatts of the resource's output was ultimately wound up in their native balancing authority area. Whereas originally they thought 150 megawatts would be needed to serve load in their native balancing authority area. So the difference between those two, the 150 minus 80, is the potential secondary dispatch, meaning that if they did indeed actually need 150 megawatts to serve their native load, and they're only producing 80 megawatts to serve their own native load from that resource, then 70 megawatts from somewhere else is coming in to fill that gap.
Oh, okay, I see. That was very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. Yep. I think we have Claire next. Claire, do you have a question?
WPTF. I just wanted to make an observation, and I know from Callie, I just joined you, but I heard from Callie that you're not speaking to EDAM, you're only speaking to the EIM. But I just want to make the observation in the context of the secondary dispatch conversation that the extent or magnitude of secondary dispatch is almost completely dependent in your definition or your approach to secondary dispatch. It's completely dependent on how you determine the base schedule. And to the extent that you have to drive the base schedule using a counterfactual, as you are in EDAM, it becomes extremely important to set that counterfactual appropriately. So I just want to make that observation.
Yeah, that's a great point. And maybe just to expand on that or clarify to the larger group, Elena, would you mind going back to slide 23, please? The point that I think Claire wanted to highlight is how that 150 megawatt amount is kind of calculated. So in the WEIM today, we have a system where each WEIM entity submits their own base schedule. They sort of electively say, these are the resources that I think are going to be needed to serve my own native load. And in this example, the WEIM entity thinks that 150 megawatts of this particular resource's output will be needed to serve their load. In EDAM, we won't have a concept of base schedules for entities that are EDAM participants. They'll still exist for folks who just participate in the WEIM, but let's set that aside for now. For entities that participate in EDAM, we won't have a base schedule. So instead, we're adding an additional market run whereby we set, instead of calling it a base schedule, we're going to call it a GHG counterfactual. And that GHG counterfactual will be based on an entire market run, and it looks just at the energy costs associated with resources and comes up with an quote unquote like optimal counterfactual based on that resource's bid and all of the other resources that have submitted bids into the extended day ahead market, with some constraints which I won't get into right now. But the way that the EDAM design is currently built is that that counterfactual will be calculated in a particular way. And I think what Claire is saying is we might benefit from looking at how that counterfactual is set. And so hopefully we can have that conversation at some point in the future. But yeah, thank you, Claire. Good point.
We have a hand from Stuart.
Right. Great. Hey, Stuart.
Thanks, Kevin. And just as we get into the next phase of this call, if the reference point is the base schedule, and in this example, it highlights, what secondary dispatch is. We do need to consider some edge cases and different things, like if that resource had an outage, its award can't be as big as it would have been, and with the base, pertaining to the base schedule. Therefore, the output's not as much, but it wasn't actually causing secondary dispatch. That's just a sheer function of an outage or a Pmax D rate or whatever. So there's some elements within that reporting we need to be cognizant of, but this is a good simplistic example.
Yeah, great point. Thanks, Stuart. Okay, I'm not seeing any other hands. Maybe I can kick it back to Keone for the next section if we're all done.
So hello, everybody. So we're going to be going over the stakeholder requested GHG metrics. So let's go over to the next slide here. And these are from the working group participants, which are supportive of the average emissions rate metric and the AER. So in this discussion that we're about to have, we're seeking to have more of a discussion on the various permutations of this. So we'll go to the next slide. So the requested metrics in December 2023 working group comments, here's the list of them. So to start with, we had CRS. They had a few comments here on the GHG attributions by fuel type, broken down into attributions from generators registered, not registered in regions, and also the attributed generation by zone. And I'll ask if CRS is on the line if they want to add any more to that or comment any more to that. We have Todd's hand up. Event producer, please unmute. Yeah, thanks. Go ahead, Todd.
Hi, sorry. So I'm happy to talk to talk as extensively as you'd like me to talk about either of those things. I mean, I don't know exactly what the format is here, but I'm happy to give more background and description of what we proposed either now or later.
Yeah, if you want to just provide a real brief background description, just provide yourself, a few minutes to do so, that'd be great.
Sure, yeah. So, we generally agree with stakeholders at the November 27th meeting that CAISO should consider different boundaries around different categories of energy, including, this average for the entire market footprint, but also that this attributed generation data, so generation deemed to GHG pricing, states or zones, attributed generation by zone, and then, what we had been calling the unallocated generation data, what has been referred to as residual market generation, unallocated generation over different timeframes. So, we put those into categories of the generation data, sort of the average emissions rate, which you had talked about, and we generally agree with the other stakeholders that we shouldn't limit that to a single average, but that CAISO could potentially provide many different averages. But with respect to the attributed generation data, so what we what we were describing was, you know, potentially 3 different sort of attributed generation metrics. One would be sort of total attributed generation, all generation attributed in a certain time frame by zone or state. And, you know, that total attributed generation in the market would be, for example, sort of one variable in the calculation of a regional residual mix. And, you know, a portion of that is tracked, a portion of that generation is tracked in Regis, so that the total attributed generation metric could not necessarily be used for retail claims or load-based accounting programs in the zone or in the state. But then you could potentially also derive an attributed Regis generation metric by zone or state. So this would be generation attributed in the time frame that is tracked in Regis. So this is you know, we had asked ISO to, you know, provide the quantity of electricity in a given period from each generating unit that's registered in Regis that was bid into the market and attributed to certain GHG compliance zones on a resource specific basis as a result of the GHG optimization method. You know, Regis could potentially sort of tag or designate an equivalent quantity of Regis certificates associated with load in that zone. And so, you know, we could talk about why we think that would be helpful. It would simply provide, you know, information to enable each state or program to sort of make its own decision regarding the eligibility of this equivalent quantity of Regis certificates based on the state's you know, situation inside or outside of a certain GHG compliance zone and the value that it assigns to that information. So allowing for kind of an up-down decision on rec eligibility in an evaluation of double counting by those states. And so, you know, there's that sort of prevention of double counting or, you know, aligning market attribution data with out of market attribution mechanisms like Regis certificates. And then the final sort of category of metrics or data would be unallocated generation data. So you could think about that again in terms of total unallocated generation, so generation not attributed or transacted on a resource specific basis in the market. And some portion of that generation may be allocated again outside of the market. So for example, tracked in Regis. So again, it couldn't be used for retail claims necessarily for market purchases outside of the GHG states, but you could potentially also have an unallocated non-Regis generation metric, which stakeholders could use to sort of characterize market purchases for retail claims or load-based programs, barring any other out-of-market allocation or attribution when they're outside of the GHG zones. And so we provided some information about the frequency, the granularity, how those metrics, and specifically the attributed generation metrics could address, you know, concerns related to the hourly versus monthly sort of data formats, any confidentiality concerns, and we provided more information about how specifically that those metrics could be used by certain states with specific programs. We also have information related to cost, but I'm happy to take any questions or to answer, you know, any specific questions that you all might have about that.
We do have a question, and thanks a lot for that, Todd. We have a follow-up question from Kevin. Go ahead, Kevin. You're on mute.
Yep. Yeah. Thanks. Just needed to take myself off mute. So thanks, Todd. That's really helpful. And maybe just zooming out, we in the November working group and in the comments that were submitted in December, we heard a request for a lot of different metrics, and we wanted to use this time to kind of acknowledge those requests, discuss them further, and specifically we wanted to do what we just started to do with Todd, and go through each metric one by one, understand the requested data better, the need for the data, and whether there's kind of a common interest in that data being published in some form or sent to Regis in this case, across the stakeholder community. So, I hope that other folks can hop in and share their thoughts about each of these as we go through them. We also wanted to convey that, every metric that we kind of produce, there's a person behind it and a set of processes that have to take place. And so there's kind of limited resources available to put the data together and send it out. So we try to be judicious in picking and allowing the stakeholder community to weigh in on which metrics are the most important to them. And one way that we were thinking of a good way of doing that would be to start thinking of how we can craft those into problem statements. And so hopefully we can, this conversation we're having now might dovetail well into the second half of the presentation, or the third of the overall agenda. But yeah, side note there. But yeah, so Todd, that's really helpful, and I'll have to go back to your comments to look at the level of granularity and the frequency of what data is published. And it sounds like we have a pretty good understanding of why we would want this data to be published, and that's sort of to prevent double counting. In other words, say there's a resource, a renewable resource outside of the state of California, and they're claiming at Regis that their generation is going to serve load in Idaho, but that the market, the WEIM, is at the same time assigning that output to serve load in California. And so there's a potential that that information could be inconsistent. And so the hope is to have the data sent to Regis, who kind of tracks this, so that they can monitor for that double counting. Did I capture that correctly?
Yeah, the only clarification I provided, so that they would be sort of our suggestion is that they use that information to sort of tag an equivalent quantity of RECs to allow different states to make their own decisions about the eligibility of those RECs in different programs. So not requiring sort of any policy stance here in particular, but basically providing more transparency for states with REC programs, to the extent that there are jurisdictions that would view the attribution, the resource-specific attribution of generation in the market to a specific zone or state to be in conflict with the retail claim that's being made using the certificate, to the extent that those go in different directions. But yes, thanks for that.
Gotcha. Yeah, so maybe just to continue that conversation a little bit. So in the market today, the ISO reports some data to Regis, and we have a process by which market participants can approach the ISO and say, hey, can you please report my meter data to Regis on my behalf. And we've really only had resources in the California ISO BAA request us to do that. So we don't have any resources in the WEIM outside of the state who have the ISO send meter data to Regis. So I guess I'm not sure in the immediate term whether we would get a ton of benefit from that, because there aren't any WEIM entities who are deemed delivered to California, who we would also then send the meter data to Regis. But I guess a different point would be that maybe we want to report it on the WEIM entity's behalf, not their meter data, but actually the GHG attributions. In other words, how much energy is coming into California and which resources we've attributed to serve load. Is that kind of what I'm hearing?
Well, I think there's a couple things in there. I don't know how sort of in depth on this you want to go, but we have suggested that. So one of the things that I think you were getting to was sort of around the any issues with sort of having to have generators sort of opt in to Regis or register in Regis for an account if they wish to have sort of if they wish to have their generation tracked. So one of the other things that we've recommended to CAISO that CAISO do is sort of provide data to support in the future, potentially all generation certificate tracking in Regis, not just the renewables, the renewable energy tracking. And so, one question that's come up is, would all those generators need to register for an account? And sort of looking at some of the other all generation tracking systems that exist, including in PJM and ISO New England and New York, that create certificates for every megawatt hour. The generators that we need to register for an account, are those that would wish to have certificates created and issued to them. And so there's a fee for account holders with, over a certain size. Otherwise, for generation, from generators that are not registered, certificates are created and placed into sort of the administrator's account. And at the end of the trading period, those certificates are used for residual mix calculations. And so they wouldn't. The ISO or the market operator would be able to provide market settlement data, generation data to facilitate the tracking of all megawatt hours of generation. And for those generators that wish to transact, to have issued, and transact specific credits, they would register for an account in Regis. And again, the renewable generators that are eligible for RPS and other programs have mostly done that. Does that answer your question? I mean, I'm not sure if that's what you were getting at.
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I guess, the point that I was maybe getting at was under the current framework that the ISO has set up with Regis, it's effectively entities, it's only entities in California ISO's BAA. And they're coming in and electively asking, hey, ISO, can you report some data to Regis under maybe a potential future
as the qualified
world
reporting
that you're
entity. Right.
Yeah. And so under this potential future world, we would be reporting maybe for all resources, or maybe a larger pool of resources that have said, hey, please report my GHG attribution data to Regis, or my my meter data, even if I'm located in outside of California ISO BA. That's kind of the end state. Is that right?
Yeah, so it would be you would communicate a quantity of attributed Regis generation by zone to Regis, and Regis would designate an equivalent quantity and of certificates as designated to to that zone or region. We think that would work with not only with the sort of timing differential between the attribution that occurs in short-term markets and the monthly issuance of Regis certificates, but the sort of market attribution data would be aggregated by generator and by month on monthly issued certificates. So that's how we think that would generally work.
Okay. Cool. So maybe I can kind of pivot to drafting like a problem statement. I don't want to try to wordsmith something live, but maybe a potential problem statement that we could put out there for this is that the ISO has available that might be has data available that might be useful to Regis in the administration of their program. The ISO doesn't currently share that information, and I guess a potential policy prescription for that would be the ISO shares that information. So maybe.
Yeah, we obviously think that attributed generation data should be shared with Regis in order to, again, sort of facilitate the coordination of these different attribution systems. But I think that the attributed generation data would also potentially be useful to other stakeholders. So attributed generation by zone during a certain time period is information that could be aggregated and made transparent to other stakeholders. I think it's most useful to Regis to tag those recs, but I think that that's also just a metric that would be of interest to other stakeholders and states. For example, again, like I said, in terms of states that are currently using default emissions factors, that are currently have other methods to assign emissions to market purchases or unspecified purchases, that attributed generation data as resource-specific attributions to specific zones would be potentially useful to help develop, like I said, a more comprehensive regional residual mix, which would be a more accurate substitute for a default, emissions rate currently used by states that sort of doesn't really facilitate market participation at all. So with a residual mix, you'd be able to see the improvement in terms of emissions over time, in terms of the market purchases, which would facilitate more market participation than just a default rate.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, maybe I don't want to take over Keone's job, but we do have that residual emissions rate metric a few ones down.
Yeah.
But maybe just a suggestion would be we're going to, as we do with these working groups, send out a list of prompts for comments, and I think one of them will be, a prompt for any problem statements that arise from this discussion that we're having. So if you craft one and
Sure.
include it in your comments, that might be really helpful.
Yeah, I was just making the point that the residual emissions rate, the attributed generation data is a part of calculating that would be needed in order to calculate the residual emissions rate.
Yeah, great point. Yeah.
Sure.
Thanks. Okay. Yeah. All right.
Thanks, Todd.
Thanks, Todd.
Appreciate it. So on the next requested metric, it was the permutations of the average emissions rate, and that was provided by CRS, PG&E, PacifiCorp, PGE, PSE, and WPTF. And I'm not sure if any of those want to further add some clarity around that. I see Claire's hand is up.
Yeah, thanks. My hand was actually up to respond to the Regis thing, but I'm gonna I'll hit this one if that's as well, if that's okay. Just first on the Regis issue, I think there's actually I think this is a bigger issue than Regis. I think there's a bigger problem, if you want to turn this into a problem statement later, of coordination around data. And that you know, that involves mechanisms for sharing information as needed by Regis. It involves mechanisms for sharing information back from Regis to this market potentially. It involves coordination between markets if we end up with multiple markets in the West, as well as state regulators. So I would just flag that I think there's a bigger coordination issue here. And that for all issues related to coordination, CAISO is clearly going to have to think through, you know, what information is confidential or would need to be provided at the behest of a specific market participant versus aggregate data and aggregated information. So that's just one thing. And then I think you were asking specifically about the permutations of the average emission rate. Is that correct, Keanu? Was that the one you wanted me to comment on?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so what we have thought, and I do agree with what Todd had commented on about the distinction between a residual and an average, but there are multiple ways you can cut an average emission rate. There's a footprint wide average emission rate of all generation that's being dispatched in a given time period. You can do that same calculation for all resources within California or within Washington or outside the market, except for California and Washington. You could do it on the basis of what's the average emission rate of resources and energy from resources that's deemed to one of the greenhouse gas pricing zones. You could imagine doing that as well for resources or energy from resources that's attributed to the non-pricing zones. And some of those are obviously going to be relevant for compliance programs, and we need them. Some of them are going to be relevant as well or only for market transparency, but is important and relevant for folks who are worried about greenhouse gas emissions, as well as the numerous entities that are popping up that are taking on voluntary commitments, be they C&I load or other utilities that are taking on this commitment. So to the extent that that data is available, I would encourage the CAISO to err on the side of comprehensiveness. If you can calculate it from your data, put it out there. Doesn't mean you have to do it right then and there. I mean, there's some stuff that will need to be, you may need to do fairly quickly after the hour for market participants. The stuff that's for market transparency, you know, if it comes out later, and we can discuss how long that later is, it'll be just as valuable. So that was the basis of our comment.
Thank you for that. Appreciate it. Stuart?
Thanks, Keanu. Yeah, I just want to build on what Todd and Claire said. I think the stakeholder group is looking for more comprehensive data. It's been a criticism of the stakeholder processes that CAISO's had is the lack of data, and there's an opportunity here to produce more data. And I fully agree with Claire. It's beyond Regis. This allows market transparency. It also allows us to do data analysis, you know, in the interest of customers. So one of the things that we're looking for is the attribution that's being done within the market, both for emitting and non-emitting resource. We want to understand a megawatt quantity, and we want to understand dollar payments. You know, there may be some confidentiality issues within that, but there's no reason that in some way that data can't be aggregated. Building on the point that Callie and myself were trying to make earlier, we also would like to see the marginal cost of GHG, both outside the GHG zone, which is available, but also inside the GHG zone, which will take some change. That could be for, as Callie said, price formation issues. There's other reasons we would like to see that particular data. And then as we look ahead to EDAM and we discuss secondary dispatch and some of the concerns there, and as Todd mentioned, looking at outstanding emission calculations and how they are done, it would be useful to understand what the attribution is below the reference pass and below the base schedules. These are some of the things that LA had put in its comments, and I don't know if it's get rolled up in some way and I'm missing it, but that's what we're looking for. We're looking for more data that we can actually run an analysis with. So recap, we're looking for attribution by zone for emitting and non-emitting resources, be it aggregated by megawatt hours or dollars, the marginal cost of GHG, both outside and inside GHG zones, and attribution below reference pass or base schedules. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, thanks, Stuart.
We have comments from LA on the next slide that we'll be going over as well.
Thank you, Keone.
Yeah, thanks, Keone.
Yeah. Does anyone else have comments on this particular item? Okay, so the next one, and Stuart, I think you spoke to this, the marginal emissions rate. So we had LA, SEE, WRA, and WPTF indicate that this requested metrics be included.
Yeah, Keone, maybe I can hop in here and just maybe ask for some feedback from the wider group as to what a marginal emissions rate would provide. Like, what is the usefulness of the data? What would it help you track? I guess said differently, what problem statement would the ISO providing the marginal emissions rate address? Would anybody have any feedback on that?
Go ahead, Stuart. Can you unmute?
Yeah.
One? Thank you.
Yeah. You can correlate that marginal emission rate to the outstanding emission calculations, be it California, Washington, and potentially other areas, as these agencies make potentially changes. I know CARB's going through some changes just now. It's another good reference point to understand what the true marginal emission rate is within the market compared to the outstanding emission rate, and obviously, as others have asked for, average emission rate. That it provides very good data to make sure no emissions are missed, or indeed, maybe the outstanding emission calculation may be too high when it comes to those purchase and retirement allowances. There's a number of things you can do with that data that would be particularly helpful and in customers' interests.
Thanks, Stuart. Kevin, did that help? You're on mute, Kevin.
I was just giving a thumbs up. That's helpful. Thanks, Stuart. Maybe Claire might have another.
All right, thanks. All right, we have Claire up next.
Thanks. The other angle that we've thought about with respect to the marginal emission rate is it gets you more information about the state of the grid. The greenhouse gas shadow price is a shadow price. It's not a price that is tied to the actual emission rate of any specific generator. It's the result of market conditions at the time. So having a marginal emission price, and actually I would say even a marginal emission factor, gives you a better basis of interpretation of the greenhouse gas shadow price. Is that shadow price due to the fact that we really are in tight generation conditions and we've got emitting resources on the margin, or is something else going on? So we also see that as valuable for market transparency.
Gotcha. So it could be useful to see, which resources are marginal and why they're marginal. Would that be used to for market analysis of the ISO's grid, or would it be used to inform state's policy decisions, or would it be useful in like where to cite a particular resource so that it has the most impact on the marginal emissions rate? Like what would be the end goal to that data? Can we unmute Claire again? I think she's here.
Yeah, I don't know that I see it as being relevant for where you cite a resource. I certainly think it, as Stuart said, might be relevant for regulators in thinking through their policies. But I also think it's going to be important for market participants in terms of, particularly those with clean resources, thinking about how they bid those and offer those resources. The other thing I think it is helpful to is over time evaluating the performance of the market. If you see a significant divergence between the shadow prices and what is truly a marginal emission rate of the marginal fossil resource that's out there, that's an area for further evaluation to see exactly what's going on.
Yep, gotcha.
Thank you for that, Claire. And so moving on, so we've covered the marginal emissions rate. We're going to move on to the residual emissions rate, and that was provided by CRS, PSE, WRA, and WPTF. That's a requested metric. Does anyone want to comment on that? I don't see any hands up, so we'll move on to the next one, which was total emissions by jurisdiction, was a requested metric by WRA. I don't know if WRA wanted to comment on that. Okay, I don't see any hands up. And the next two were the enhancements to today's Outlook emissions data and enhancements to the ISO emissions tracking report. And that was by Puget Sound Energy. Anyone from Puget Sound on? I want to comment on that. If not, we can come back later. In LA, I'm sorry.
Before we move over to LA's, I just wanted to talk about the residual emissions rate a little bit. It's just to share some of my thinking on it, if anyone cares. I mean, the ISO's perspective on this. So the ISO has, we have a lot of good information. We know which resources are online in a particular period of time, and we've already published that kind of average emissions rate. And we also, along with that data that we published after last month, 2 months ago now, the November working group also had the GHG attribution data. But one thing that you might be able to observe from that attribution data is that the GHG awards, which, as I mentioned earlier, are really just the WEIM transfer into the state of California, are only a small component of the total imports that are occurring in the market. And so there's a lot of transactions that are tagged and transacted bilaterally outside of the ISO's market. And where I'm going with this is the residual emissions rate that the ISO could publish could be based on the generation that we have available to us minus the WEIM attributions. In other words, the energy that's serving load elsewhere. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the other generation isn't already spoken for. And I think, in other words, that there could be a wind resource in Nevada that's tagged and serving load in Washington, and the ISO wouldn't know that to be the case. We don't know that there's a contractual claim on that energy. And so the residual emissions rate that the ISO could publish would be inherently limited to the data that we have at our fingertips. And so I think it goes to some points that Claire and Todd had mentioned earlier, which is the ISO can provide inputs into a useful residual emissions rate, but might not have all of the inputs into the an ideal residual emissions rate value. So I just wanted to raise that point, and I think some other folks might have their hands up. But Keone, you're running the meeting, so I'll zip it.
Yeah, could you open up the phone line for Claire?
Thanks, Keone. Yeah, I think you nailed it, Kevin. Behind the residual emission rate, at least in my mind, is a mechanism to allow market participants to claim energy, to claim the owned and contracted energy. And I'll be very clear here. I see this as potentially an important alternative for a dispatch model for non-pricing programs, but it's also very important for those voluntary buyers of clean energy to have a mechanism to be able to claim that energy. And so what would be left is truly the unclaimed stuff. So that's not just a data, it's just not just a metrics issue. It's creating a mechanism to allow those claims to be recorded and then backed out of the calculation of the emission rate to give you a true residual.
Thank you, Claire. Can you open up Sydney's line? Go ahead, Sydney. You might be on. Oh, go ahead.
Yes. Hello. Sydney with WRA here. Claire captured well kind of our thinking in requesting us, to prevent any sort of counting issues regarding claims, especially for non-pricing states. So I understand what you're sharing, Kevin, regarding what data the ISO can provide. So really just seconding Claire's comment here, and we'll think on this further, but something we're keeping in mind with an eye on the whole Western grid.
Thanks, Sydney, for that clarification. And Todd?
Yes, so I just wanted to reiterate, yeah, that I agree that a true residual mix, true regional residual mix should account for all transacted generation, including but not limited to sort of market attributions, as you said, Kevin. But the ISO's residual mix or unallocated generation data would be an important part of transactions that we would want to account for in a residual mix. So as you said, we want to get closer to this true regional residual mix. So the fact that you don't necessarily have all of that transaction data or market data at your fingertips, it would be a combination of different data sources, and the ISO is an important data source among those. So thanks.
All right, thank you. All right, so any other comments? If not, we're going to move on to the next slide. And as I mentioned to Stuart, these are comments from LA. These are LA's requested metrics. I'm not going to read through each of them. And I know Stuart talked to a lot of these. Stuart, do you want to add any more to this? Go ahead, Stuart, if you can open up again.
Thank you, Johnny. No, I don't want to add to it, just echo this need for more comprehensive data. I think it helps our stakeholders. It helps us do an analysis for customers. And importantly, I think it will also help regulators. You know, there's changes getting made at CARB. Washington's bedding in its program at the moment. There's going to be the need for some further refinements as more and more renewables come on the system, and there's still emitting resources left. And I think it's going to be extremely helpful, not only from reporting, but from an analytical point, to have more data that we can usefully share amongst ourselves and make informed decisions. But thanks, Keone.
Thanks, Stuart. Appreciate that. Okay, so now what we'll do is move on to the. Go ahead, Kevin.
Do you mind if I ask Stuart a quick question? Shoot, we lost him off the queue. Yeah, I was wondering. So the data set that we posted after the last working group meeting had the GHG attributions aggregated by hour, and I'm wondering if that is sufficient detail for the purposes that you're talking about, or would you want to see it and it's not differentiated by emitting and non-emitting, as you suggested earlier. It's also not, differentiated between RTD and RTPD, like the 5-minute and 15-minute markets. Would you want to see that level of data as well, or is an hourly amount useful for the purposes that you're describing?
By hour is perfectly fine, Kevin. However, we have to distinguish, between emitting and non-emitting, particularly as regulators contemplate the price of carbon and, changes there as they pursue their goals. I think it's going to be critically important to distinguish between emitting and non-emitting, because if you go back to your example earlier, both emitting and non-emitting get the GHG payment, and only the emitting have the compliance obligation. So it's imperative that we have that data so that we understand the cost to the customer of achieving those goals, and we can challenge, is there a more cost-effective way of getting to carbon neutral? And that's why I would like to see it distinguish and emitting and non-emitting, and inside and outside of GHG. But I would suggest you have it on a 5-minute basis. It's probably easier to produce it on a 5-minute basis, and even if it's aggregate, not maybe down to individual generator, aggregated in some form, and we can roll it up from there. So it's probably just as easy on a 5-minute basis, and we can do the aggregation. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Stuart. And so we'll move on to the next slide, where we'll talk about the consolidated problem statements and prioritization. And let's move on to the next slide. So what I'll do is I'll summarize here is, what we've narrowed it down to, these topics here, the general feedback. And what we found is for the first bullet here was the majority of the working group participants, where stakeholders are seeking further understanding of how problem statements were consolidated. And then for the bullets 2 through 4, the 6 cities highlighted this. The distinguished problem statements that address current market operations from those that relate to future operations under EDAM, and then deferring the consideration of problem statements that relate to future operations under EDAM, and then also for the consolidated problem statements that identify concerns under current market operations and identify data available to analyze the scope of the problem and the potential solutions under current market operations. I'm not sure if Bonnie or anybody else wants to comment on these last few points that I've mentioned.
Claire, can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you now. Go ahead, Bonnie.
Good. Bonnie Blair, I work with the Six Cities group. I don't, I think the articulation is accurately reflects our recommendations and is pretty straightforward. I think, you know, our main reason for wanting to defer at least extensive or intensive consideration of problem statements that relate to future operations under EDAM is basically we don't know what EDAM is going to look like. And so there's, I think, a pretty high degree of speculativeness about trying to figure out how things will work in the EDAM world until we know a lot more about how many participants there are going to be and where they are and what their portfolios look like. And so we think at this point, at least between now and at least a year or more from now, that it's a better use of resources to address concerns that that are in the present and affecting markets as we speak.
Thank you, Bonnie. Appreciate that. And I'm gonna look to my working group here, see if Anya wants to say anything on the problem statement.
Yeah, thanks so much. And just a big thank you to stakeholders for submitting comments. It was really helpful to see, you know, the flavors of kind of perspectives when it came to the metrics and what you're looking for, but also with the problem statements. And I just want to kind of highlight this last bullet here around, you know, potentially opening the door to having problem statement sponsors or sponsors for, or even sponsors for kind of the sub issues. I think, you know, some of you come with a wealth of information or a perspective that I think can be further uncovered in the working group context. So just wanted to plant that seed now for potentially sponsoring either one of the problem statements or one of those sub issues as a way to kind of come and present at the working group to share why a suggested problem statement needs further exploration. Thanks. Hey, CUNY, back to you. You might be double muted.
Oh, I apologize. I'm speaking here and no one can hear me. Put myself on mute. So,
all good. We all do it. Go ahead.
Bonnie, did you have anything else to add?
Can you still hear me?
We'll move on. Yeah, we can hear you, Bonnie. Go ahead.
Okay, sorry. No, that was, I really just wanted to kind of highlight the reasoning for recommending that we not delve deeply into problem statements about how EDAM is going to work until we know more about what EDAM is going to look like. And that, yeah, that's all I wanted to give a little more color to.
Okay, we appreciate that. We're going to be asking more about that later on. But I think we're going to want to get some context with what we know from EDAM as it is. that's a good idea, though. With that, Mary, do you have anything to add?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, I just actually wanted to piggyback a little bit on what Anya was saying about identifying a sponsor for some of these problem statements. I really like that idea, and also it may be useful to consider actually establishing kind of a subgroup of working group members or volunteers who may be able to kind of work together as sponsors to potentially move some of the problem statements or kind of sponsor some of the problem statements. I think that would be a helpful exercise to consider. So just wanted to support what Anya was suggesting.
Hey, Mary, thanks so
Thanks,
much
Mary.
for that support. And maybe as we go through some of the kind of consolidated problem statements, maybe we can spend some time talking about who might volunteer to be a sponsor, or at least kind of work with a subgroup there. We've gotten feedback that folks would kind of like to keep most of the discussions in this forum, but maybe we can kind of talk more about, what that looks like to have a sponsor or subgroup as well. That sounds great. Thank you.
All right, and Mary, who are you representing again?
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't introduce myself. I'm with a public generating pool.
All right, thank you. Okay, if we could move to the next slide. And these are problem statement additions provided by LA, SRP, and WPTF. And I'm not sure if, Bonnie, do you still have something else to say? Your hand is still up. And I'm not sure if LA or SRP or WPTF has anything more they want to add to the problem statement additions listed here. Stuart, go ahead.
Yeah, I think just in terms of that first sub-bullet, the intent is for this working group, whether it's now or at least create a roadmap to visit on this in the future, as the carbon emissions start to reduce. I think we've got to look at how we accomplish those targets within the market construct, without completely abandoning the market construct and switching off at transfers because we only want necessarily renewables. We still have to be able to access renewables, out with our BAA. We may want to limit the amount of emitting resources we have, and that's something that we need to discuss. And it's not just from a price cap. GHG zone bases like Washington, California is non-price areas as well. And I would like to see some discussion, or at least create a roadmap to visit on that, because I think that's going to be a challenging problem. We've got a number of different utilities with targets. The targets are for potentially different years if you look at different states, and some are price-based, some are non-price-based. But how do we get that into the market construct and still, seek the lowest cost dispatch? That's kind of what I'm looking at in that first bullet point, Keone.
Thank you. Appreciate that. All right. Well, with that, I think we'll move on to the next slide. And what these are problem statements that are consolidated. Rather than reading them off, I'm just going to indicate that number 4 was re-added. That was the current price formation that does not provide full transparency into the total marginal GHG cost, leading to inaccurate price signals and reduced price transparency. And I'll ask Anya as we go through these next slides if you wanted to add anything.
Yeah, maybe just kind of to go back to a little bit of our previous conversation about potentially having problem statement sponsors, I'd like folks to kind of maybe self-identify if there's a problem statement that resonates with you. You know, for some of these problem statements, they were either kind of an amalgamation of what we heard from various entities, or were submitted from certain stakeholders. You know, maybe I'll put WPTF on the spot here. WPTF suggested problem statement 4. It had made it into kind of the list of 16 problem statements. We kind of had a discussion in our last working group meeting where we recognized some of the consolidation didn't fully capture the nuance that was meant to be captured in this problem statement, so it's been re-added back. And this might be a good example of a problem statement that's right for a program or a problem statement sponsor. If WPTF wanted to sponsor this, kind of bring folks together to talk about kind of some of the price formation elements of GHG and kind of present to the working group on it, that might be, you know, one way to embrace that problem statement sponsor idea and bring some of that perspective into the working group. So maybe just wanted to open the door there and see if Callie or others would be willing to take on a kind of a sponsorship role with any of these problem statements. And these problem statements that are on this screen really represent kind of those related to market operations and GHG design, kind of the core elements of the current WEAM and EDAM design. So maybe I'll just pause and see if there's any reactions to the idea of a problem statement sponsor for any of the statements related to market operations and GHG design.
And if you don't have an answer now, you could always follow up when we have comments going to be submitted in later on. We'll be talking more about that at the end of this discussion.
Sounds great. Yep, I think that'll be great for the template. And I see Callie's got her hand up.
Yeah, Callie has her hand up. Go ahead, Callie.
Yeah, so I guess this obviously a new one.
Hey, Callie, you're coming in a little too soft.
Sorry, my audio is. I'll talk louder if that helps at all.
It does. It does. Thanks.
Okay. Maybe a very sensitive mic I have. Yeah, so I was saying on this price formation one, happy to, you know, talk through it more at an upcoming meeting. Yeah, but maybe it would be useful for us to talk about what it, like when you say sponsorship, what that fully entails, because with this problem statement, I think some of the discussion would probably involve needing some support from CAISO to run some modeling. I think Kevin had mentioned that earlier, like drawing up examples or creating a little solver, you know, to kind of show different pricing outcomes. But definitely we support this being in the policy process and in this. So yeah, we can chat offline a little bit more about what it, like the full involvement of sponsorship.
That sounds great. And I think maybe as a first step, kind of maybe presenting more information, but happy to take that offline too in terms of what next steps could look like with some of these problem statements. And that's an open invitation for everyone. So thank you.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks.
Thanks, Callie. And so the next group here, problem statement 5, I'll just read off the main bullet here. When there are multiple unlinked GHG regulation areas or different reporting requirements by different states, market participants may result in double counting, undercounting, or inconsistent counting of emissions. So it lists the variations of this issue below. Does anybody want to further comment on this one? Go ahead.
Maybe I'll just kind of do a call out. This is Anya Gilbert again with the policy team. You know, this came up earlier in our discussion. I see Claire's got her hand up as well, but I think some of this has been highlighted through the comments that CRS as well as PacifiCorp and others have kind of put forward. So maybe again, ripe for a sponsor, kind of a presentation on this, but recognizing, this is really kind of fits under the topic statement of state coordination and is a broader rubric, but kind of what within the CAISO's jurisdiction and kind of data provisions, how can we help in this area? So with that, I'll turn things over to Claire. I see her hands up.
Yeah, thanks, Anya. This is a little outside the instructions you and Keone have given me, but I just want to observe, this is, in my view, very related, a little bit to 6, but very, very strongly to 7. So, and so I still think we have a lot of, and I'm not suggesting that we don't, there aren't different ways to separate these, but I think this problem of double counting and under accounting or inconsistent accounting, it's writ large. It's about the greenhouse gas pricing programs. It's about the non-pricing programs. It's about all the different ways that we try to account and attribute greenhouse gas emissions. So I will flag, I don't know if I'm, maybe I'll be a partial sponsor of this issue, but this is something that WPTF is very interested in.
Thank you, Claire.
Thanks, Claire. And we're going to get to, the kind of issues for kind of beyond GHG pricing policies in about 2 slides. But I think having your perspective on the crossover that you're seeing at the state level with kind of those beyond GHG pricing policies is going to be important. So thank you.
All right, so moving on to the next slide. We move to the next slide, number 6. Thanks. So the ISO does not provide all metrics desired by market participants, and it lists what this includes. Does anybody want to further comment on this one? Okay, Sydney? Go ahead. You might be muted on your end, Sydney, because we can't hear you. Can you unmute, Sydney? Go ahead, Sydney, give it another try.
Okay, how about now?
Now we can hear you.
Sorry about that. This is Sydney from Portland General Electric. No edits or concerns, just wanted to chime in and say that we support problem statement 6B. So thank you for including that in there.
Okay, you're welcome. All right. We'll move on to the next slide. And this accounts for there is not a market mechanism in the states with a declining cap on emissions, and it lists the reasons for this in 3 bullets here. Does anyone want to add anything to this problem statement?
Sure, this is Anya Gilbert with the CAISO. Just recognizing kind of the evolution in greenhouse gas policy in the West. Not every state is going to have a price on carbon. And for those states with a declining cap, we're hearing variations of, the type of policies that are being requested to be reflected in the market. So kind of from that utility perspective, as Stuart outlined, when there's a utility kind of goal and how that operates either in a state with a declining cap or a price on carbon so that this utility itself can meet their corporate goals. The perspective of a utility that's looking to offer generation over the course of a year that can meet that state target over a given time period. And then also reflecting, a state that has both that declining cap and a price on carbon in the market. So recognizing there's different flavors of these kind of direct kind of carbon pricing policies, and really looking to see, which entities would like to participate as either a sponsor of this problem statement, or kind of come and present on this topic. I think would be a helpful starting point to kind of move this conversation forward. And I'll note that one of the topics, and Keone will get to this later, that we'd like to kind of tee up is potentially bringing up this idea of beyond GHG pricing policies and some of the variations of this up at our next working group meeting on February 22nd. So it's a topic that'd be coming up sooner rather than later. But any perspectives on this problem statement, or folks that want to raise their hand to sponsor this problem statement or a piece of the problem statement?
Claire, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sure I'm going to regret this later, but I will volunteer to sponsor a piece of this problem statement because I do, again, see this fundamentally as an attribution problem and the need for a mechanism to allow attribution of resources, energy, and emissions to load.
Thank you, Claire. Appreciate it. And Stuart?
I'm glad Claire sponsored it, but happy to, help Claire and be interested. I believe, Anya, is it Doug Howe that's presenting next go round? Be interested in hearing his thoughts from the non-priced areas. Is that what you're referring to?
I think we'd like to kind of have that. It's not fully confirmed, but yes, that's the good preview there, Stuart, of what might come. But yeah, and it, if there's other perspectives or other folks that want to present on aspects of it, that's very much welcome.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, with that, we'll move on to the next slide that goes over the topic prioritization. So we have 4 items here. We have the emissions tracking and accounting. We have the ISO market operations and GHG design, and we have the state coordination, and we have beyond price-based GHG policy. So the prioritization results received through the Slido poll and written comments, and are just one input into how topics will be prioritized for discussion moving forward. It's not an end all and be all kind of point. It's discussion topics that will also be relevant or will be relying on the problem statement's readiness. Timing. And
Hey, Keone, this is Kevin. I'm having trouble hearing you, and I'm not sure if you're talking on the working group schedule slide. I didn't hear anything on my side. Still not hearing it on my end.
I'll step in for Keone. This is Anya. We kind of touched on this earlier, but for the February 22nd meeting, we'll be focusing on the kind of market design associated with the GHG counterfactual in the WEAM and EDIM, as well as kind of begin exploring those topics of beyond GHG pricing policies. And then really looking for, you know, stakeholder presentations for some of the upcoming working group meetings and hopefully some of the problem statement sponsors, and we'll be soliciting, you know, who those are in the comment template. If you weren't able to raise your hand today for that, you'll be able to do those in comments as well. But room to present in upcoming meetings. And Keone, I may have heard you for a moment there. Are you back?
I don't know. Can you hear me? Because I haven't done
Yes, we can hear you now. Yep.
Okay. I apologize. I don't know what happened. I was just talking and you guys could not hear me. And I wasn't on mute. So anyway, Anya, I think you explained that we're going to be seeking in these upcoming meetings to provide topic priorities, subject priorities, and presentation requests that is outlined on the upcoming page to give directions on how to do that. So let's go to the next page. Unless, Anya, did you want to add anything more to this?
No, nothing more to add.
Okay. So for the next steps, we're going to have comments due by the end of day, January 25th. We'll have a commenting template provided to the working group page. And we should have that up probably tomorrow. And the next working group is scheduled for February 22nd. And you could submit your request, as we've been talking about during this call, to this email address. And as you know, the working group link is provided there as well. Anything else, Anya, I'm missing?
No, just a big thank you to stakeholders for your time and attention and engagement this afternoon. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you to everybody. I apologize about my audio cutting out. I'm not sure what happened. And I hope I did justice for Isabella Nicosia, who's out not well right now, and hopefully she'll get well soon. And thanks for everybody's participation. And with that, I guess we will, we have a news release that I'll share with you guys. And many of you already know.
Meeting is now over. You may now disconnect.